Well, the Echoes and Origins project was something that we came up with the idea a few years ago, and we went to the National Lottery Heritage Fund to see if they would support it, which they did. It's essentially looking at what I describe as the two foundational narratives of this building, built 300 years ago in Liverpool's colonial period. And it was a school for looked after children. It was an orphanage for the poor children of Liverpool. And we thought that would be a great project to investigate that, to see if we could look at the lost voices of the children from that period in the 18th century and 19th century.
Well, the project was always going to be participatory, so we knew that we could ground the story in a modern context with people whose lives echo those of the children of Bluecoat School. We wanted to bring people into the project who had lived experience.
So we wanted to engage with two groups. One group of adults who had had care experience and a group of young people who have care experience also. The young group who we met through the organisation Kinship Carers came for weekly workshops with a dance artist, Paula Hampson, who has a long relationship with Bluecoat. We focused on Victorian Liverpool and more of what the children would have ate, what games they would have played, what church services would have been like. Week by week we sort of brought together this amazing performance with Paula.
I mean, in terms of the research that informed this project, we've been working with a collaborative doctoral award candidate, a student from the University of Liverpool called Michelle Irvine, and she is doing some amazing work to try and find out about these children whose voices aren't heard at all. But we have lists. She has lists of admissions to the school in the 18th century, which is the period she's doing. So she was able to at least come up with these names and then do some research into, from parish records as to what happened to these children when they were born, who their parents were. They might have lost a parent because they were orphans, many of them. So we were surprised that what we did find out, mainly through Michelle's research, about the lives of the children in terms of their daily diary, what they would do, what they would eat, what their playtimes were or weren't, because they had quite a tough life. It was very much a period of hardship, and the children had to work a lot of time before they did any lessons. So they actually worked physically in a manufactory, in other words a factory, which was part of the school.
Liverpool's Bluecoat School, like many other 18th century charitable institutions which were being built across the nation during the period. It was a purpose-built facility which was designed to moralise and educate and industrialise the poorest sections of society by targeting their youngest and most impressionable demographic. It was a building that provided the upper echelons of society with a space to demonstrate that they were charitable, respectable, and that obviously was beneficial to them. Because Liverpool's population is expanding For instance, at the start of the period, the population was roughly 5,000 people. By the end of the century, it's reaching up to 80, 90,000 people. There's a growing concern at the cost of managing these indigent poor that couldn't, independently sustain themselves. But equally on the flip side, there were benefits to these children. When you compare them to other poor children who were their equals in the parish, they, as I said, even though it was basic, they did receive an education which was beneficial to them. They were incorporated into a very important social network through Bluecoat. They were provided with, somewhere to sleep, regular meals, which they may not have otherwise had access to.
The school itself had a much bigger footprint when it was operating. It went right up School Lane, along Hanover Street and back, I think. And that was because they did so much manufacturing, stockings, and they had dormitories and things like that.
Picking oakum, which is unpicking bits of rope, making pins, spinning cotton. I think it was harsh, but I mean, it was probably a lot better than a lot of children.
Yeah.
But they actually had to, they could somewhere to sleep, they were fed, they were clothed, and most of them would have had some sort of career as a result. So I mean, in many respects, they were poor children who, in a sense, were quite privileged to be here.
Yeah.
But that's why we wanted to really dig deep and see if we can get to the individual stories, because there was obviously, if you're that young and you're apprenticed to go to sea at 14, it was a hard life.
From humble origins, I came from note. Little seed, me ma called me. Said I was to be planted in the rich soil of the big charity school, to blossom one day into a fine man with fancy words, new worlds to explore. In me dreams I sailed, 'neath seas of stars I steered me ship, master of me own destiny. Crawled out of the grime-soaked gutter, from parents with pockets full of poverty, bent low with sadness and shame, I soared above the dirty streets, clothed in tattered dreams, days dreaming of a better life, nights conjuring fantasies, spinning a master's garb from my faded blue coat, woven from old sail canvas. I fashioned a jacket with bright buttons of battered tin glittering sunlight silver. I rose up, left the grimy streets behind to sail on mirrored seas, until one night, me fortunes changed forever. I, a lonely mate, the silver moon, a flipped coin, was tossed in fate's twisted kiss, swept into the arms of the seething sea, rocked gently in its soothing lullaby. I dreamt once more of me ma's kind face, her pride at the sight of me bright blue coat, eyes haunted by hunger but filled with hope. And I whisper a prayer, with the frothing sea blooming all around me, like white flowers floating, and I sinking, me lungs filling. Ma, can you see? Can you see the flowers blooming all around me? Your little seed blossomed into the man you once prayed for. Her lovely face drifting, gentle as a snowflake, her warm smile spreading over the waters, the touch of her soft hand as I sink down into the fathomless sea, folded deep with her gentle embrace.
We wanted to bring people into the project who had lived experience of the things that we were exploring, the narrative that we were exploring. So that was a group of adults who had experienced care or who had a contextual relationship with what it's like to be disenfranchised in that way, perhaps.
A small group of adults with care experience who were then supported creatively by a group of women from the Swan Centre who are a domestic abuse charity. I think they were quite open. They sort of expressed that they felt good about being involved in a project that was centred around similar experience to their own. In the end, rather than sort of focusing on people's own life stories, we really wanted to use their experience to inform the research of the children that actually lived in the building.
They worked with a writer called Moggy McShane. They came up with some incredible stuff. They really dove deep into what it was like to be one of these children and used lots of historical information and text that was shared with them through Michelle.
One way that we could crystallise the stories that the workshop groups did was to work with two amazing artists who are known as Stand and Stare. And essentially what they did was to gather as much information as they could about the stories of these children. They came up with the idea of this building, this installation, which would be 10 windows of 10 characters with their silhouette in each window. And it's interactive, so you can sit and listen to those stories in the gallery. And while you're listening to the story, there's a sort of collage of imagery as well. So they really bring to life, in a very visual way, these 10 quite contrasting stories.
The silhouette book was one of the only sort of pieces of archive material that directly showed us images of the children, even though they were silhouettes.
One of the silhouettes is Janae.
Top left.
I see the
And the modern, yeah, that's why I put the hoodie on to try and make it look modern. I had hoop earrings in as well, but you can't see it.
No.
You know, in that particular time, that was the philosophy of people who were in power, that is people who were rich, moneyed people, were able to define and describe communities who they saw as lesser than them. And one can't deny that that was part of what was happening at that particular time. Some people might argue that it was a good thing that they took these children off the streets, so to speak, and cared for them and improved their prospects for the future. And some people might say, well, their improved prospects actually benefited the philanthropists who were people who were making money, without a doubt. Yeah, I guess the children were better off outside of poverty to some extent, but then they had to live, I suppose, and exist within that notion of being grateful to their benefactors. And I don't think there's any doubt that some of those children were given a better life at that particular time. I suppose it's defining the better. That's where the criticism and the critical thinking would need to come in.
So one of the most poignant stories for me for doing this project was discovering a Bible which was belonged to a boy called William Seed, who was apprenticed to sea and died age 17. So he had a very short life. So it wasn't, a successful time for everybody. On the other hand, you've got people like Richard Ansdell, who became a successful painter, a Royal Academician. He had part of Lytham St Anne's named after him. Some of them did very, very well with the children. So what we're trying to do with this project is look at that breadth, if you like, of stories.
There's letters from children sent home to their parents or sisters from the late 19th century, detailing trips that they went on, and there's pictures as well of school trips. So, as we've said, it was a long time, 1717, to when the school moved, and obviously, attitudes around bringing up children and educating children had changed dramatically.
The most significant period of change is during the final quarter of the 18th century. During this period, contemporary social attitudes towards the education of poor children began to shift, so that greater emphasis was placed on their academic and moral improvement and enlightenment, instead of the children's ability to provide the raw manpower, if you like, that the nation felt it required, purely because we're starting to see machines taking over that role. Equally, at the same time, children are becoming more closely associated with innocence, which it was understood needed protecting and nurturing.
Money for old rope. Mute, sightless, barefoot, we are the secret children of shadow and stone. Cherub silhouette, distant cotton for blazers, inner city blues. Richard and William, ideas above their rank but useful in school. Spinning, making pins, Jane Wallace, Anne Gage, silent, keeping their heads down. While merchants chart routes, colonial legacies, the sails swell with pride. A mixed cargo of cotton, tobacco and worse. Treasurers, trustees, all at sea, drowning in respectability, pockets lined, palms greased. Their philanthropy and us, the deserving poor, hostage to fortune. Back to spinning yarns, we stow away our spirit for another day. Weave a silent tale until our fingers bleed truth, money for old rope.
This is round here, isn't it? That's one of the streets where we just walked down.
I was always creating these wee dens for myself.
You need a bigger tent.
Oh, look at that.
Oh my goodness.
It's like my motorbike. Yeah. That's my motorbike. Cool. How cool is that motorbike picture? That changed my bloody life, that motorbike. Yeah, Rob, when you come to the that one with the afro just before in the fireplace, if you can pause on it, and if you can pause on the motorbike one, if the whole thing takes 4 minutes and I'm on for 40, you'll see the cycle 10 times.
It's Jackie's 2010 memoir, Red Dust Road, that led us to invite her to the Bluecoat this evening. Jackie was born in 1961 in Edinburgh to an unmarried white Scottish mother and Nigerian father, and was given up for adoption at birth. Her adoption story and journey to find her birth parents are the subject of the book, whose themes echo many that we've explored during this project. Jackie's been to Bluecoat before, and we're so pleased that she's agreed to return to discuss her own personal journey and how her story connects with that of the Bluecoat children. So if you could please give a warm round of applause for Jackie Kay.
The world has changed, and materialistically things have changed so much, but things that land you in care as a child don't change. You lose a parent for whatever reason. That parent-child relationship and the sort of trauma that occurs from that being broken up, that hasn't changed.
For me, the modern experience of being in care is really not dissimilar, because it's lonely. It can be very lonely, and I'm for sure they felt those things. It was an authoritarian time where you got the cane and you got hit for stepping out of line, and they were really trying to create a community of adults who towed the line. Now we understand more, I hope, than ever about trauma, intergenerational trauma and disenfranchisement from your origins, and we're beginning to really talk about it in mainstream society. And for these children, there was none of that. Their expectations of life were quite limited, probably. We owe it to ourselves and actually our humanity to acknowledge that the system has let loads of people down. I think the looked after children topic, it touches so many people. You would never know. I think more people than admit it sometimes have experienced being taken from their families or their parents. Giving more people the opportunity to tell their stories safely, it's the first step often in a healing journey. And if we can use historical narrative to help people to do that, I think we should always try. And Bluecoat is an example of a place where those narratives live.
Because the part of Bluecoat's philosophy is to engage with the community. And I think for this particular project, say if we not just looked after, but the other side of the project, looking at the history of slavery and why this building is standing today, and I think that acknowledging that was the first kind of step. This Echoes and Origins has given Bluecoat the opportunity to link with communities. In Liverpool, Liverpool has a big history, not just with Blondell, of slavery. We know that, and the slave trade, and the gains that the city is still benefiting from. We don't see it in everyday life, but that is still there. That's the backdrop to this being a city with all the other histories that followed.
I think one of the things we've learned through doing this project is the two strands we came up with, which was colonial legacies and looked after children. The more we went on with the project, the more they interrelated, and there's a sort of intersection between them. We're finding it was the same colonial process that had founded the school, which we interrogated in part one, was coming through strongly in part two. That colonial mindset, in a sense, was running the school.
I think very much in the same way, the sort of excuses for slavery, that narrative of civilising the uncivilised, it was quite similar for the children here.
So what Bluecoat has managed to do with this project, in my view, is that it's been able to sit with the discomfort of racism and Bluecoat's connections very, very concretely via the slave trade to racism as it is experienced today and still exists, as we know. So that to me is a kind of a real engagement through the arts to the community. In social work, for example, over the years, black children and children from other minority ethnic communities have not fared well, been longer in care, longer to be adopted or fostered, or so there are all those issues still bubbling away, like they were for those young people who were brought to Bluecoat to be schooled. They were vulnerable. They had, obviously issues in terms of parents or parenting. There was poverty. There's all of those things which come together. I think in looking back and looking forward within this project.